Mephibosheth, a man crippled since childhood, forgotten and despised, experienced a remarkable turnaround in his life when he was honored in Israel to the point of sitting at the king's table. This story is well known. For many, Mephibosheth has become a symbol of someone who rose from poverty to prosperity, from humiliation to exaltation, from obscurity to nobility. But what if I told you the story doesn't end there? That's right. There's another part to this story that, for some reason, people don't often talk about, preach about, or sing about. Perhaps it's because, in this lesser-known part of the story, Mephibosheth was betrayed, wronged, and lost everything he had once again. Undoubtedly, Mephibosheth's story is exemplary, but not in the way most people think. Want to know more about all this? Then watch this video until the end, because you're about to learn who Mephibosheth was and what really happened to him according to the Bible. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan and the grandson of Saul. Yes, Mephibosheth was the son of David's closest friend. Here's another important detail about his family. He was the nephew of another man also named Mephibosheth. It's crucial not to confuse the two. The other Mephibosheth was the son of Saul and his concubine Rizpah, and along with his brother Armoni, he was among the descendants of Saul handed over by David to be executed by the Gibeonites. This occurred in the heartbreaking story where Rizpah camped next to her sons' bodies for months to protect them from the dishonor of being devoured by animals. Interestingly, the Mephibosheth featured in this video, Jonathan's son and nephew of the other Mephibosheth who was killed, was spared from death on that same occasion because of David's loyalty to Jonathan. Since these two men share the same name, belong to the same family, and appear in the same biblical context, it's important to distinguish between them. The exact meaning of the name Mephibosheth is debated, as the original spelling is uncertain. In some versions of the Bible, for example, the name appears as Merib-Baal, Merib-Baal, or Memph-Baal. Depending on the variation, the name could mean anything from hero of Baal, or Baal is advocate, to opponent of Baal, or he who shatters Baal. We know that the generic term *Baal* means Lord, but due to its association with the Canaanite deity, Jewish scribes eventually replaced Baal with Bosheth, which means shame. As a result, the commonly accepted meaning of the name Mephibosheth is he who disperses shame, or from the mouth of shame. Regardless, it's not a flattering meaning. Mephibosheth's life was marked by tragedy and disappointment. He was born into royalty as a prince of Israel. However, when he was only 5 years old, his life changed completely. His grandfather, King Saul, his father Jonathan, and his elder uncles all died in battle against the Philistines. When Mephibosheth's nurse received the devastating news of the deaths of his grandfather and father, and the collapse of Israel's royal lineage, she fled hastily with the boy. Mephibosheth's nurse's desperation is understandable, as it was customary at the time for a new dynasty to annihilate the entire lineage of the previous royal family to prevent any future claims to the throne. However, during her hasty escape with Mephibosheth, the child fell from her arms, resulting in him becoming crippled in both feet. Afterward, Mephibosheth was taken to Lo-Debar, a location on the border of Gilead. Lo-Debar, situated east of the Jordan River, was possibly also known as Debir. The name Lo-Debar, or Lodabar depending on its pronunciation, signifies a place without pastures. However, contrary to some popular beliefs, Lo-Debar does not seem to have been entirely insignificant. In fact, its history includes disputes among Syrians, Israelites, and Assyrians. The common notion that Lo-Debar was a completely unimportant, forgotten place likely stems from an interpretation of the prophecy in Amos chapter 6. In this passage, the name Lo-Debar is intentionally altered in the Semitic style, manipulating the vowels to resemble the Hebrew word for insignificance. In essence, the prophet used a wordplay on the name Lo-debar to express that Israel had rejoiced over the conquest of nothing, emphasizing the futility of their victory. However, this does not imply that Lo-debar was a barren wasteland. Rather, it suggests that the Israeli conquest of the location was worthless because it was short-lived and soon forgotten. Indeed, Lo-debar was eventually captured by Syria. In Lo-debar, a man named Machir, the son of Amiel, took responsibility for caring for Mephibosheth. Later, Mephibosheth had a son named Micah. His story gains prominence when David, by then firmly established as the king of Israel, remembered his friendship with Jonathan and the covenant they had made about 20 years earlier. David inquired whether anyone from Saul's house was still alive, so that he could show loyalty and kindness in honor of his friendship and covenant with Jonathan. At this juncture, David adopted a countercultural approach. Rather than seeking out a descendant of the former dynasty to eliminate them, a common practice among kings of that time, he sought one to honor and show mercy to. During this search, Ziba, a former servant of Saul's household, informed David about Mephibosheth, a young man crippled in both feet who had been living as a fugitive in Lo-debar for at least 15 years. Many scholars note a tone of prejudice in Ziba's response to David, as he seemed to emphasize Mephibosheth's physical condition, perhaps implying that he was worthless and not deserving of attention by the king. Regardless, David disregarded such implications and immediately ordered that Mephibosheth be brought to him. David's actions toward Mephibosheth can be seen as a powerful illustration of God's grace towards sinners. God extends mercy and kindness to those who are unqualified and undeserving. He rescues individuals destined for judgment and death, granting them a new life in his presence. David welcomed Mephibosheth with honor, restored Saul's lands to him, and allowed him to dine daily at the king's table. Moreover, David commanded Ziba to serve Mephibosheth. However, Ziba was far from trustworthy. During Absalom's rebellion, when David's son attempted to usurp the throne and forced David to flee Jerusalem, Ziba revealed himself as a great betrayer and opportunist. The Bible recounts that Ziba met David with provisions and supplies, which were certainly helpful during this challenging period. Yet, Ziba took the opportunity to falsely accuse Mephibosheth, telling King David that Saul's grandson stayed in the capital because he coveted the throne and believed he would reclaim his family's kingdom. It seems that David believed Ziba's lies, as he decided to give Ziba all that belonged to Mephibosheth. That's right, all the wealth, properties, and possessions Mephibosheth had received upon leaving Lo-debar were handed over to his treacherous servant. What Ziba did was serious, as in those times accusations of treason often led to death. Later, when David returned to Jerusalem after Absalom's death, Mephibosheth went to meet the king to defend himself and prove his innocence. When Mephibosheth stood before David, the king asked why he had not come to him earlier. Mephibosheth then had the chance to reveal Ziba's betrayal, explaining that he had asked Ziba to saddle a donkey for him to travel to David since he was crippled. Instead, Ziba abandoned him and devised a scheme to accuse him of treason. During the time David fled from Absalom, the Bible records that Mephibosheth deeply mourned the king's plight, following the customs of that era. He refrained from washing his feet, grooming his beard, or washing his clothes. This was a clear display of loyalty to King David, demonstrating that he never supported Absalom's plans and never sought the throne for himself. After hearing Mephibosheth's side of the story, it appears David believed him. Yet, surprisingly, the king decided that Mephibosheth's inherited properties would be split between him and Ziba. The Bible doesn't explain why David made this decision. Some scholars suggest David might have been unwilling to hold Ziba accountable for his betrayal, possibly due to the fragile emotional state David was in at the time. Others speculate that David might have doubted the full truth of Mephibosheth's explanation. Regardless, the king chose a neutral position to resolve the conflict. Amazingly, Mephibosheth decided to give up his inheritance entirely. He allowed the traitor to keep everything, showing that his primary concern was David's well-being. At this point, Mephibosheth's words to David reveal the type of character he possessed. The Bible records Mephibosheth saying to the king, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has returned home safely." Though Mephibosheth's story is often referenced in sermons, it's rarely told in full. Sadly, people frequently focus only on the prosperity narrative. The crippled and forgotten man brought out of obscurity to receive a royal inheritance, a privileged position, and a seat at the king's table. Few are willing to preach about the same crippled man who, despite being betrayed by his servant and innocent of any wrongdoing, was forced to share his inheritance with that treacherous servant. For many, it's challenging to preach about someone who remained loyal even when wronged and unfairly treated, even when everything in life seemed to go wrong. More difficult still is preaching about Mephibosheth's selflessness. He gave up all his material possessions, caring little that his personal enemy kept everything that was his. Truly, Mephibosheth's story offers profound lessons. However, its focus is not on prosperity, but on the character of a just man who, despite tragedies and difficulties, stayed true to his principles. For Mephibosheth, personal wealth was insignificant compared to the fact that God's chosen king had returned to his rightful place. He didn't set his eyes on earthly things, but instead focused on God's sovereign purpose for his people. To Mephibosheth, sitting at the royal table held no meaning if the Lord's anointed was not on his throne. What mattered most to him was his communion with the king, more than all the wealth he could have inherited. Now, leave a comment. Did you already know the story of Mephibosheth in the Bible? Thank you for staying until the end, and may God bless you. See you in the next video.